Hi, Shalom, and welcome to my channel. My name is Tamar, and in this video we're going to explain about the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Tanakh. The Bible is the most sold book in the whole world, and the Hebrew Bible is probably the single book that had the most influence on the world and the way we know it. Next video in this series, I'll talk about this influence and how our world looks based on the Hebrew Bible. This video will talk about the basics of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. How is it different from the Old Testament? What does it include? Who wrote it? How many books are there in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh? There are 24 books, and Tanakh is an acronym for Torah, Neviim, and Ketuvim. Hebrew Bible is divided into 3 sections. The Torah has 5 books, 8 in the Neviim section, and 11 in the Ketuvim. The Christian Old Testament has 39 books. Why is there a difference between our 24 and their 39? So there's a few differences. First of all, they separate books Shmuel and Kings and Chronicles and Ezra, Nehemiah into 2, whereas we have these as single books. Another reason is the Asar, the 12. We put these together as one single book, whereas the Christian Old Testament divides these and has each as a separate book. So these are 12 books. And the last reason has to do with books that are included in the Old Testament and not in our Hebrew Bible. These are the external books, and I'm going to make a separate video about that, explaining what they are and why they're not included in our Hebrew Bible. The Torah section includes the 5 books of Moses, which spans over the course of 2,500 years from the creation of the world till Moshe's passing. The Neviim have 8 books that we separate into 4 earlier Neviim and 4 later Neviim. This spans over the course from Moshe's passing and the time that they entered Israel till the destruction of the first temple. The 4 earlier Neviim are mostly easy to read stories that tell the story from the time of Moshe's passing and entering Israel and the conquering till the time of the destruction of the first temple. And the 4 later Neviim are less stories, they're more longer prophecies. It's a little bit harder to read these. And we group Asar, the 12, into 1, where each of them is small separate prophets. The Ketuvim has 11 books. 3 we place together in Emet, an acronym of Eyov, Mishlei, and Tehillim, which have the same song and sounds to it. And we have the 5 scrolls. Now these we call the 5 scrolls because we read them in a scroll on certain holidays. For example, Koheles, Asalestes, we read on Sukkot, and we read it in our synagogue on a special scroll that we have intended for that. So these are the 5 scrolls. We said that the Bible is divided into 3 sections, but what is the significance of these 3 sections? So there is a difference between the books, and the Torah is considered the most holy, Neviim in the middle, and Ketuvim the less. What does this mean? The Torah is the highest level of prophecy. We call it Aspaklaria Meira. That is the prophecy of Moses. And Neviim is prophecy, and Ketuvim is Ruach HaKodesh, which is a lower level of prophecy. Prophecy is basically the word of God coming to you. You are a vessel to the word of God. And we know that there was a certain time in history where there were many, many prophets. And people went to prophets in Israel even for simple things. For example, Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, before he was king, he went to ask the Navi, ask the prophet about his donkeys being lost and where they may be. And we also know that at some point in history, prophecy and prophets ceased to exist. Now, there are various reasons why this happened discussed in our Jewish sources, but we know it for a fact that it existed and that it stopped to exist. So out of all the prophets that we had in history, only 48 prophets and 8 women prophets, their prophecies are in the Bible. The prophecies were spoken to a specific generation and a specific point in time, and most of them were not written in the Bible. Those who were written in the Bible we say ze nevuah shehutzricha ledorot, a prophecy that is needed for generations to come, meaning it has significance and a lot of value for generations to come in the future, meaning it not only has value for the generation in which it was spoken, but it has value for future generations, and they need to learn something from these prophecies, and then they were written and included in the Bible. An important note is that our Bible is not a history book. Yes, it includes a lot of historical facts, but it's not intended to be a history book, meaning it won't include all the information that may be relevant historically, but it's an educational book. It has educational values for us and things that we need to learn on a spiritual level. This prophecy was ending in the world. That is when the Bible was finalized. The Bible was finalized into 24 books as we know it by Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the Great Assembly, in the early days of the Second Temple. Among this Grand Assembly were the final prophets that existed in the nation of Israel. The last Navi, the last prophet, is Malachi. So we have the Torah, which is Moshe's prophecy, which is the highest level of prophecy. And we have Neviim, which is the other prophets, and the ones that were needed were the ones that were written into Neviim. Now, Ketuvim is not a prophecy. It's not the word of God being delivered to you, but it's Ruach HaKodesh. It means you have a special spirit and you're able to see beyond what a normal human would see. Intended to be written. It's not a prophecy that was needed and then later written, but it was intended to be written. For example, the book of Ruth and the book of Esther. The book of Ruth was written by Shmuel Hanavi, who wanted to explain David HaMelech's, King David's lineage, and explain the story of Ruth. And the book of Esther, Esther sends to the Grand Assembly, Kitvuni ledorot, write me in. So the book of Esther was then written. Mordechai was actually one of the Grand Assembly members, and it was written. These are still written in a high level of Ruach HaKodesh, but it's not the same as a prophecy. So who wrote the Bible and when? So we have tradition about each book, who wrote it. For example, Moshe wrote the 5 books of Moses. The book of Iyov, actually, we have various opinions as to who wrote it and what generation it took place in. Yehoshua wrote the book of Yehoshua. Last final sentences of Yehoshua, where it says that Yehoshua died. So we have a tradition that Pinchas continued and completed the book of Yehoshua after Yehoshua's passing. David HaMelech wrote Tehillim, and the Grand Assembly wrote Yechezkel, Daniel, Treasar, and Esther, and King Solomon wrote Eicha, Mishlei, and Shir Hashirim. Like we said, it was finalized and completed into a book by the Grand Assembly, and they had the final prophets, and they were the ones that finalized our Tanakh. Very interesting that some books were actually disputed about, and they thought to actually remove them from the Tanakh, like Kohelet, which can be very confusing and pessimistic, and Yechezkel, which has very deep, high-level spiritual that they thought can also confuse people. These 2 books, for many reasons, remained in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, but I just thought that that was an interesting fact. Now, how do we divide the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, into sections? Now, this is very interesting since the chapters that we use today are actually taken from the Christians. So we mentioned that the Christians divided some of our books into 2 parts, like Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet, 2 parts to the book, and that's also widely accepted. And a lot of people are surprised to hear that the chapters that we use today are taken from the Christians. It was done by Cardinal Archbishop Stephen Langton in the early 13th century. Only the chapters in Tehillim are an original Jewish division and not the chapters that were divided by the Christians. You may ask, how did this chapter system become widely accepted by Jews as well? Historically, what happened was that there were a lot of debates between Christians and Jews about different prophecies and about the truth of Christianity versus Judaism. And at first it was added in the end so that we were able to answer and understand, different quotes. And at some point it was printed with the chapters, and this version of the Hebrew Bible became widely accepted. New Jewish books and Jewish teachings used these chapters and quoted from these chapters. So now we have thousands and thousands of books who make quotes using these chapters, and changing it is very, very difficult. Now, we do have a Jewish original division of the Tanakh. First of all, we have the Pesukim, the sentences. That is an original Hebrew Bible division. And we have the Parashat Shavua, which means we take the Torah and we divide it into about 54 portions, and each one is read on the Shabbat in our synagogues, which means that we complete the Torah every year. This was the tradition of Jews living in Bavel. There was another tradition of Jews living in Israel to divide the Torah into something called Sdarim, which means it's smaller chunks, about 150, so that means that they would complete the Torah in about 3 years, allowing them to delve deeper into the parashot. A little bit confusing, we also have parshiyot, which means paragraphs. In the whole Tanakh, we have paragraphs that are distinct from another, but they're not numbered. They're separated by having a space between each other. So like I said, even if we wanted to stop using these chapters that originated from Christians, it would be almost impossible with all the books that were written later on based on these chapters. So that was the basics of the Hebrew Bible. Hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. Bye, shalom, see you next time.